Valtran 7 breathed like a sleeping animal. The whole moon exhaled mist through its reeds and drank its own rain, and the bog spread out forever. Black glass puddles stitched together by ropes of vine and mats of slick weed. Nothing moved fast here. Even lightning took its time, walking its reflection across the water before committing to the sky. Darren Miles dropped his scout shuttle through weather that greeted visitors with a slap. The hull rattled, the stabilizers swore, and the onboard med scanner kept pinging a single, maddening note. Faint life sign, massive volume, distress prolonged. He circled once more to be sure the signal wasn't a ghost left by some long-dead tracker. The ping steadied, slow and stubborn, like a heart too proud to quit in the proper dramatic fashion. He set down on what passed for firm ground, a braided root system masquerading as a landing pad, and listened to the rain thicken. He'd crossed worse places. War had taught him the texture of ruined cities, and the taste of ship fire had taught him what lungs do when air becomes glass. But the marsh had its own silence, a heavy, indifferent quiet that swallowed the small noises people make when they're about to be brave for the wrong reasons. He sealed his hood, slung the med kit, and stepped off the ramp into water that forgot how to be shallow after the first stride. The scanner kept time. Ping, ping, ping. He followed it through curtains of hanging fern and skinned branches that clawed his sleeves with the entitlement of the truly damp. Twice he went into the waist, once to the chest. The marsh tried to argue him into sinking. He argued back with long, rude strides and a grim laugh that sounded like boots drowning. He smelled it before he saw it. The cold copper of hunger, the bitter edge of scorched hide, the faint sweet note living things give off when they insist on doing so against orders. Then the reeds parted, and the world narrowed to 2 gold coins set in mud. The eyes were vast, the kind that could make a man feel inventory down to the lint in his pocket. They stared without blinking, the pupils trying and failing to focus, the lids heavy with weeks of gravity. Around them, a head the size of a cockpit rose a fraction and sank again. Horn ridges showed through a mask of dried silt. What should have been a mane of bioluminescent filaments lay plastered to the skull in dull ropes. Beyond the head, the body disappeared into the bog as if the moon had tried to swallow a star and given up halfway. Vralion, Darren's memory supplied, apex of the rift biota, myth in 14 languages, the reason the old empires built walls around sky. Young, judging by the horn flare and the 2 clean edges of the fangs. Alone, judging by the silence in the reeds. It should have terrified him. Instead, the recognition landed like paperwork on a desk already buried in forms. A living thing was stuck and dying. The rest could wait. He raised a palm, slow and open, and let his voice take on the weight he used for people shaking in operating tents. "Hey, big one, I see you." The eyes flinched at the sound, not away, toward it, an almost laughable flinch for something that could have ended a shuttle with a paw. The head tried to rise and found the mud determined to keep its guest. A sound scraped up from the chest, not a roar, the memory of one that had forgotten how to be loud. "Right," Darren breathed, not bothering with the poetry he didn't have. "Okay, we're going to do this the slow, insulting way." He waded closer, boots vanishing to the ankle with each step. The surface skin of the bog broke around his knees and glued itself to his thighs. When he reached the angle of the jaw, heat bled through the mud to his fingers, fever, not strength. He set his hand to the scaled line where head became neck and kept it there, letting his own warmth read as a promise. Up close, the smell was worse, the kind of rot that happens when the world starts taking back what it made. The Vralion's breath hit his wrist in uneven drafts. Dehydration had taken the elastic from the skin, the mucous membranes were the color of old paper. A bone along the forelimb sat wrong beneath the mud, not puncturing skin, not healing either, some insult dealt days ago by panic and leverage. Darren crouched in that reek and pulled vials in sequence. Electrolyte gel, glucose suspension, a multi-species shock dampener he'd only ever used on a thrashing load lifter clerk who'd stuck his hand in the wrong inverter. He thumbed a sterile injector on, waited for his hands to stop arguing with rain, and found the least bad spot along the neck ridge where scale gave way to softer tissue. The needle met resistance and then slid, and the scanner on his forearm began to tick in a way his blood liked more. Not dying here, he said, like he was making a note for the file. Not like this. The eyes eased, infinitesimally. The lids came down and up, slow as a tide that needs extra time to remember its job. The head shifted another finger width out of the mud, sank back, and stayed at the slightly better angle, as if the beast had decided to humor him. Rain tapped at Darren's hood. The marsh considered this new arrangement and declined to comment. When he looked up, the shuttle had disappeared behind the reeds. The world was just him, the bog, and a myth deciding whether it believed in Terrans. The silence pressed. He set his palm firmer against the jawline and let his own pulse run through the bones there, a metronome offered to a dying symphony. "Breath in," he murmured. "Breath out. I'll keep count if you keep trying." Something under his hand answered, small and exact. A single, stubborn swallow. Night arrived without bothering to darken anything. Cloud threw a dull lid over the swamp. The rain learned a new tempo. Darren rigged a tarp from the shuttle's emergency sail and tied it between two trees that didn't know what trees were supposed to be. He angled the edge so the runoff sheeted away from the Vrolion's muzzle and into a catch basin he'd hacked out of his water recycler. The first liters ran black with tannin and patience. After that, the filter stopped complaining as loudly. He worked by the bright, ugly light of a triage lantern. It turned the world into sharp pieces and pretended they all fit. He washed the crust from the beast's lips with saline warmed between his palms and watched a tongue the size of his forearm twitch toward moisture, like it had been waiting for this small decency since the last good day. He soaked a field sponge and squeezed thin lines of clean water into the corner of the jaw until swallows began to happen without permission. The first injection hit the bloodstream like sunrise in a windowless room. The Vrolion's respiration found a rhythm that didn't sound like a thin rope rubbing against rock. The heart, so far away beneath armor and youth and the unlabeled ache of being made for the top of a chain, climbed from emergency into effort. Darren set a drip line and secured it with adhesive he stole from the kit meant for human arms. It stuck to scale with the offended hiss of things doing work they weren't designed for. "Complaints accepted in writing," he told it. "No forms on hand." He eased the mud back from one wing with his bare hands, taking care to keep the membranes from tearing where suction loved them. Each pull cost him the skin of his fingertips. Each freed inch showed the flirt of bruising where vein met air. The beast endured it with the infinite patience of creatures too tired to argue, only flinching when his fingers strayed near the broken forelimb. He filed the location with the care of a man cataloging live grenades. Hours tallied themselves. He spoke without content, the sort of nonsense that performs warmth when there are no useful words left, humming half-songs, cursing at the rain, telling a story about a Terran river winter that had tried to drown him and failed. Every time his voice went quiet, the Vrolion's breath wandered. Every time he started again, it found its way back. Like a ship correcting course toward a lighthouse, it refused to dignify by admitting it needed. At some point, he dozed with his forehead leaned against the horn ridge, the absurd posture of a man who has forgotten every rule he used to think he understood. He woke when the massive skull shifted under his skin. The eyes were open. They were clearer now, the gold less dimmed by distance. They studied him in the exact way he'd studied them, taking inventory without judgment, asking untranslatable questions and listening for their own answers in his posture. He lifted his empty hand, palm out, fingers loose, and let the beast smell the chemical and human mess of him. Hot breath rolled across his wrist in careful drafts, as if the Vrolion were learning a book by turning one page at a time. The pupils thinned and widened, catching the triage light in long, wet crescents. No growl, no show. A thing that had been born to teach others fear chose, for one generous moment, to be curious instead. "Yeah," he said softly, throat raw. "We're both ridiculous." He cut the tarp's corner and fashioned a funnel that drained slower, more exact. He added a measured trickle of nutrient to the water and watched the swallow reflex kick in like an old friend arriving late and unapologetic. The scanner at his wrist began drawing nicer lines. Oxygenation crept up. Lactates ticked down out of the panic range. The body remembered itself in stages, like a town coming back online after a blackout. "Let's get the pressure off you," he said next. More to prove he could still sound like a medic than because he thought the Vralian cared about plans. He wedged a rescue board under the shoulder with the wrong geometry, braced the far side with lengths of scavenged root, and made the marsh do a neat trick: give back a little of the elevation it had stolen. When he levered up, the suction let go with a gasp and a burp that would have been funny if it hadn't smelled like war crimes. The head came up another inch. The neck found a line that didn't kink the windpipe. The Vralian exhaled in a single shaky gust that hit his chest and walked straight through to his spine. Darren swallowed an unreasonable lump of relief and coughed it into a useful noise. "Better," he said. "Now, if you can forgive me, I'm going to touch the leg you're protecting like it's my religion." He didn't get his hand there. The beast moved first. It was nothing, and it was everything. A flex of the toes caught in the mud, a slow, painful unpeeling of claw from suction, a drag that freed half a span of limb into dirty water and left it there, trembling. The motion caused a groan that made the reeds ripple. When it finished, the Vralian lay panting, eyes shut against the effort, jaw clenched around a sound it refused to make again. "Show off," Darren whispered, suddenly grinning like a lunatic at a creature that could wear his shuttle as a hat. "You absolute maniac. Do that twice more, and the moon will have to file a complaint." He slid his hands under the freed section and felt the bone wrong and trying. The break wasn't clean. It had the fuzzed edges of damage done in panic. He wrapped a temporary brace of composite splints and soaked bandage, talking all the while like reassurance could be molded into plaster. The Vralian held him still with its gaze when he finished, a heavy, bald acknowledgement that would have embarrassed any human it was given to. The rain softened for the first time in days, falling in threads instead of sheets. Beyond the tarp, the marsh resigned itself to mourning. Darren sat back on his heels, knuckles scraped raw, clothes adhesive with bog, and realized his lips were moving around a cadence he hadn't chosen. Breath in, 2, 3, breath out, 2, 3. The Vralian's sides moved under that borrowed beat, as if grateful to be bossed around by a small creature with nothing better to do than lend a rhythm. "Okay," he said at last, almost a vow. "We are going to stand you up on that ridiculous leg. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. And when you do, I want you to roar just enough to scare me, not enough to ruin my work." The eyes narrowed in a way that could have been humor. The huge head rolled closer, half an inch, an absurd intimacy, and stopped with the horn ridge resting against his shin like a deliberate punctuation mark. The scanner chimed a new note. Hydration threshold passed, metabolic return within forecast. For the first time since the ping had pulled him out of his comfort and into this bog, Darren let himself look beyond the next 10 minutes. He pictured wings opening against a sky that had forgotten how to make room for them, pictured water sluicing off armor that had been too long a wait, pictured himself, ridiculous and satisfied and cursing at his own tears, standing in sunshine that wasn't filtered through canvas and rain. "Deal," he told the beast, and patted the horn twice, like knocking on a door he intended to keep using. "We've got time." Morning found Darren with his cheek against the horn ridge again, stiff as a folded map. The tarp drummed a softer rhythm. The rain had spent some of its greed. He levered himself upright, tasted old metal on his tongue, and got back to the arithmetic of saving something too big to lift. He started with leverage. The shuttle's belly winch wasn't meant for myths, but it didn't need to be. He ran a cable through the mangrove bone roots that made a web over the water and built an ugly, stubborn pulley from a cargo hook and a prayer. Twice the line slipped, once the hook screamed like a violin and tore a strip of bark the size of a door from its cradle. The third try, everything held. He braced his boots against the muck, hit the spool, and watched the Vralian's rib cage rise a handspan out of its grave. Mud doesn't yield, it negotiates. Every inch he won had to be paid for with an inch of something else. He paid with his shoulders and an inventory of curses that would have embarrassed his drill sergeant. The beast helped where it could. When Darren said push, it pushed, not a thrash, not a panic, but the exact pressure he'd asked for. The first time this happened, he laughed out loud and nearly swallowed a mosquito the size of a torque wrench. He cut away the leached ropes stuck to the wing webbing, muttering apologies when the membranes shivered. He bathed the sores under the armor plates with antiseptic from a dwindling bottle, then with boiled swamp water when that ran out. He picked burrowing ticks from the crease of the jaw with a pair of forceps and the focused tenderness of a man learning a new religion. The IV bag emptied. He hung another and watched the color return to gums that had been a bad omen yesterday. He changed the leg brace when the swelling finally began to go down, fingers working with a gentleness he hadn't trusted his hands with since the war. At noon, the marsh reminded him it wasn't a hospital. A raft of mud wolves ghosted in under the reeds, 6 sets of lantern eyes low and mean, ribs sharp under slick fur. They were patient things, used to waiting until a good story turned into carrion. Darren saw their angle, saw the half-circle closing around his tarp, and reached for the shock baton he'd stuck in the mud like a stake. His heart went sideways and kept running. He didn't roar. He didn't have that in him. He made himself tall in the way of small animals who know how to convince a moment it's not worth the trouble, and he walked at the lead wolf, as if what he was doing made sense. When it sprang, he didn't even think. He cracked the baton and lit the air with a snarling arc. The wolf yelped, flipped, scrambled, and went sideways into the dark. Darren turned the baton on the line of them and drove them back into their own patience. When he looked over his shoulder, the Vralion was watching with pupils blown wide, not fear, something like interest. "Don't start," Darren told it, panting. "I know, I'm ridiculous." The weather shifted again in the way swamps do. No clouds, just intention. Steam rose. The tarp sweated. Darren took his jacket off and used it as a pad to keep the winch line from biting into the root where it bent. He fed the Vralion in slow drips, then in careful strips of nutrient gel scraped onto his own palm, letting the giant tongue drag warmth and grit away until both of them smelled faintly of sugar and debt. He sang when his throat would stand it, tunes that had outlived their makers, the kinds of songs written to be useful more than beautiful. The beast's breathing found the bars and stayed there. Function over flourish, a mutual preference. That night, Lightning walked the horizon and considered its options. Darren checked the splint twice because he didn't like the story his fingertips told him about the bone ends. He heated graft foam against his own skin, waiting for the canister to show the exact shade the pamphlet promised, meant pliable, then laid it along the fracture with the same care he used to tuck a child back into a blanket in a field hospital a lifetime ago. The Vralion's great paw lifted and hovered a hair above his shoulder, as if offering balance, as if learning how not to crush was a trick that could be learned. Storm mosquitoes found them then, glossy, mean, the size of thumb bones. They went for the soft places. Darren cursed into the netting and smeared salve where he could reach. The beast shook its mane once in a ripple that fanned his hair back like a bad idea. He laughed despite himself, tired and a little hysterical, and the Vralion made a sound that wasn't a purr and wasn't not, a basso rumble that vibrated bricks he didn't have and would have liked to. By the third day, the mud had lost its best arguments. The winch groaned and the rescue board shifted, and with a collective insulted slurp, the swamp let go of a hindquarter that had not seen air in a fortnight. The leg bristled with pins of pain, quivering in the way that means nerves are reporting in again and not happy about it. Darren pressed his hand against hot skin and breathed slow until the tremor settled. The beast's eyes slid shut and opened like a tide, making up its mind on a beach. He slept that night, leaning back to back with a skull bigger than his past, and dreamed, if it was dreaming, of square sunlight and clean water and a single enormous footstep that landed and did not sink. The first attempt at standing wasn't brave. It was math and timing and the way bodies remember how to disagree with gravity. Darren adjusted the cable angle until the pull would lift more than drag. He braced the splinted forelimb with a lattice of scavenged roots and an obscene amount of medical tape. He set his shoulder under the horn ridge because that would let him lie to himself about how much he was helping, and counted them in. 1, 2, push. The Vralion didn't leap. It placed weight with the deliberate caution of a planet. The good forelimb dug into peat, flexed, held. The rear legs uncoiled in a slow, furious chord, muscles firing in order. The broken limb trembled, took a little, no more, and Darren felt the cables take the insult away before it could become a disaster. Mud sang their failures back to them with tiny, rude sounds. The head lifted, the neck curved. Then finally, with a noise that belonged to machinery refusing to admit it had always been alive, the chest rose clear of the ground. They froze there together, an absurd tableau of triumph no one was around to clap for. Darren's breath sawed. The beast's breath thundered. He grinned into the side of that impossible face and said the first nonsense that found him. "Look at you." The second attempt failed, not for lack of will but because the leg argued and the cable sulked and the swamp remembered it could mimic quicksand. They didn't push it. He got the beast back down without a crash, smoothed the tremor with his palm, fed water until the tongue came hunting for more, and told the marsh what he thought of it in words that made the frogs go silent. On the 5th morning since the shuttle had decided to land on a dare, the clouds finally went someplace else. Sunlight, the color of old honey, hit the tarp and turned the drops hanging from its fringe into a string of beads. Darren switched off the triage lamp and witnessed the miracle of the world lighting itself. The Vralian blinked like a sleeper who had started to believe in dawn again. "Ready?" he asked, and this time the ridiculousness felt like ritual. They counted. They pushed. The leg held just long enough for balance to choose a side. The cable took the insult without complaint. And then the young apex of a species built to scare gods unfolded in full. Mud wept off armor plates and caught the light in 1,000 dirty mirrors. The wing membranes unglued from themselves and spread a little, like kites learning their old names. The skull lifted high enough that Darren had to lean back to keep eye contact, and still couldn't. He stepped away, suddenly aware of the size of the life he'd been touching, and the life stepped with him. To keep him in its gaze, to keep him in its gravity. "Easy," he said, hands out, as if he could catch it. "We're not sprinting." The Vralian didn't sprint. It stood. It trembled end to end with effort and pain and the tectonic work of not falling, but it remained vertical. Tears hit Darren's cheeks without his permission, burning tracks on skin rough with marsh. He laughed at himself and at the absurdity of joy that large, and the beast leaned its massive head down until the horn ridge rested against his shoulder in an acknowledgement so careful it remade the word. He made it take a step because that is what you do with miracles. You ask them to repeat. The forelimb hovered, set down. The rear set after. The bad leg shivered and did not betray them. He felt the ground vibrate under the decision. He felt himself vibrate with it. They practiced until the day wore thin. Twice the Vralian flagged and Darren forced it down before collapse could re-break what he'd begged into alignment. Once the cable snapped with a whip crack and caught him across the hip, he went to one knee with a curse and came up grinning because he had already decided to survive this day. The beast watched him, something like worry in the tilt of its eyes, and nudged him back under the shade with a snout larger than the door to his first home. Late afternoon, the marsh remembered to be dangerous again. A sink shelf gave way under Darren's boot, and he dropped hip-deep into sudden, sucking mud. The more he fought, the more it clenched. He had time to think how embarrassing it would be to drown 10 meters from a legend he'd saved before he stopped moving, got very calm, and reached sideways for the route he'd watched a bird land on yesterday. His fingers brushed slime and slipped. A shadow fell over him. The Vralian's good forepaw descended, not to pin, to offer. Claws splayed, pads turned toward him like a cup. He grabbed the thick fur between toes and felt his shoulder scream as the beast lifted, until the mud spat him out with a wet, obscene kiss. He sprawled on his back and laughed at the sky, dizzy with relief. The beast bent its head and huffed into his face, warm and disgusted. He wiped a smear of black from its nostril and flicked it away. "Fair," he said. "We're even." That evening, when the sun went down like a slow coin into the horizon, the Vralian did something he would remember every time he closed his eyes thereafter. It stood on the root-laced rise above the tarp and unfurled both wings to their enormous, imperfect span. The membranes were torn where mud had been mean and healing where medicine had been stubborn. Light passed through them and turned the clearing gold. The beast drew a breath that made the reeds lean and loosed a sound that the marsh had been designed for without knowing it. Not a threat. Not even a declaration. A call, low and far-carrying, tuned to distances larger than this moon. It went up through the ragged canopy and out across the flat water and into the thin air over the far dunes, and kept going until Darren felt the hairs on his arms lift to listen. He stood there with his hands useless at his sides and let the sound finish. When it fell back to earth, he found his voice, smaller and practical and exactly enough. "We'll need to redo that brace tomorrow," he said, "because promising work for tomorrow is one of the ways people swear oaths they can keep." The Vralian turned its head and looked at him as if to say it had already scheduled him. Then, with a care that never stopped astonishing him, it folded the wings, stepped down to the tarp, and lowered its skull to his shoulder until the weight felt like a roof in a hard rain. The marsh exhaled. Somewhere far out in the reeds, frogs tried to imitate the call and failed adorably. Darren leaned into the horn ridge, and for the first time since he dropped out of an angry sky into this patient hell, let his body believe that standing was a thing that could keep happening. By morning, the swamp had learned a new sound: footfalls. Not many, not fast, but there, the punctuation of weight placed on purpose, each step followed by a pause, where both of them listened to see if the world would hold. Darren shortened the brace, shifted the splints, and wrapped fresh bandage until the wrongness in the bone felt contained by plan. The Vralian stood without the cable for a count of 10, then 12, then 30, sides heaving, eyes bright with the fierce embarrassment of creatures who hate to be watched being brave. They made a corridor out of the roots in the places he'd hardened with gravel from the shuttle's ballast. The beast learned the route in 2 passes and pretended it had always been there. When the leg buckled, Darren made him sit. When it didn't, he made him stop anyway, because caution is love, wearing an unfashionable coat. The sun burned a hole in the clouds and found the gold under old mud. Light skated along armor ridges and came back warm. The radio crackled once with a voice from a place with chairs. Command, late to the party and suspicious. He flicked it off. He wasn't finished talking to the swamp. They were on the 3rd lap when the air changed. It thinned in the particular way that means engines are near and pretending not to be. Darren caught it first as a pressure on molar roots. The Vralian caught it next and froze so completely the reeds forgot to move. A shadow crossed the clearing, large and deliberate, then another, then more, until it seemed the sky had decided to try on a darker color. They did not arrive like a fleet. They arrived like weather that had learned choreography. Shapes slid out of cloud, vast, vaulted wings, ribbed with ancient strength, bodies whiter than storm bellies, bellies scored by old maps of battles won and regretted. Adult Vralians dropped into the margins of the clearing and found perches in the mangrove bone where no perches had been the minute before. The ground learned a new patience under the pressure of their landing. One, larger than any guest Darren would have dared, came forward with a sound like a distant avalanche deciding to stop. The young one, his young one for a kind of time, lifted his head and made the low, square note Darren now knew was the beginning of speech. The elder answered with a chord that made the tarp shiver and the triage lamp gutter and Darren's sternum vibrate like a tuning fork. They circled each other in an economy of movement only the enormous can get away with. The elder inspected the splinted limb. He smelled the antiseptic. He blew air along the line where scale met graft, and then, with the gravity of a verdict, he did not disapprove. Branches on the far side rattled with a smaller, uglier approach. The swamp coughed up a skimmer with company logos where conscience should be. 4 figures in slick suits and a cage folded like bad origami in the bow. Poachers with paperwork, always worse than the honest kind. Asset located, the lead one said, not bothering with masks when money could do the breathing for him. He raised a dart launcher and aimed it at the soft place under the jaw where Darren had placed his first needle. Stand clear, human. Contracted capture. Darren stepped in front of a legend without thinking, a ridiculous silhouette against a bioweapon in a tie. He's not your contract, he said, mouth dry. Back off. The man laughed the way men do when they want to turn fear into contempt by adding volume. Move. The elder Vralian turned his head, not fast. He spoke, not in sound, but weight. The pressure rolled outward from his chest in a slow tide, invisible and irrefutable. The exact frequency of make a better choice. The dart launcher drooped toward the mud as if magnetized. The lead poacher fought his own elbow and lost. Behind him, the youngest of his crew made the mistake of raising a second gun. The young Vralian stepped forward, not quickly, and set his good forepaw on the cage with the lightness of a mountain trying tenderness. Metal that had not considered humility discovered it could learn. The cage flattened, then surrendered. Darren didn't say thank you. He said, to the men who had come into a patient place with sharp things, "Walk away." He didn't yell. He didn't bargain. He left no language for them to hide inside if they chose wrong. They backed the skimmer into the reeds so fast it nearly swallowed them. The swamp closed over their wake as if embarrassed to have hosted a cliché. Silence returned in the manner of a room that has just witnessed the right story and is deciding whom to tell. The elder lowered his head until one enormous eye filled Darren's day. He breathed in the place where cloth over human chest had been glued with rain and stress, found the beat underneath, and made an almost imperceptible motion with his jaw, up, down, the nod of kinship in a grammar that had survived extinctions. He lifted his muzzle and traced a sign in the air with the tip of a horn, a simple loop closed by a straight line drawn through it, a mark for boundaries that hold. Then he pressed the sign down, gently, into the mud at Darren's feet. It steamed for a heartbeat, and then glowed faintly, as if the swamp had been taught a word. The other adults repeated the gesture along the clearing's rim until a circle had been drawn that every bird and insect and contract lawyer could see. Sanctuary, Darren's bones translated because bones know old languages. The young Vralian turned and butted his crown into Darren's shoulder with exactly the same measure of force Darren's shoulder could stand. The pressure said not yet goodbye. The eyes said thank you in a dozen dialects of light. Darren, filthy, bruised, suddenly conscious of how much he loved the stupid tarp, found his mouth shaping invitations to debriefings and medals and didn't bother to force the sounds out. "You're going," he said instead, practical as a bandage. "Good." The elder bent until one horn touched the splint. Breath warmed the cloth. Something under Darren's fingers eased, not healed, eased, the way pain makes room for motion when it realizes it is no longer guarding a secret alone. The sky, which had been holding still out of respect, remembered it could be blue. The adults opened their wings and reintroduced the clearing to shade. The young one shook mud off his ankles with offended dignity, then crouched. He did not jump. He rose, a long, deliberate undrowning, and the swamp, which had taken him for its own, let him go because it had been given better work, holding a mark. They climbed until the reeds were suggestions and the roots were maps. And Darren was a small story on a large world who had done one correct thing all the way through. The circle they left in the mud did not fade. It pulsed, almost imperceptibly, when Darren slept under the tarp that night, as if reminding his pulse of what it had agreed to. In the morning, the marsh had new manners. Mud wolves gave the clearing the wide berth given to churches and ruins. Birds lined the farther branches and discussed the changes with earnest incompetence. The wind carried a taste of upper air, clean as rinsed metal. Darren packed slowly. He replaced every root he'd cut with two he'd braced, laced the path he'd trampled with woven reeds so it would hold for smaller feet, and took down the tarp last. Under where it had hung, the ground was dry for the first time since he'd landed. He almost left it that way, then made himself puddle it with a bucket. Humility suits sanctuaries. Command found him on the fourth ping, breathless with second-hand glory. "Sergeant Miles, we're receiving anomalous signals from your sector." "Are you?" "I'm fine," he said. "Patient discharged. Recommend this grid be flagged no-go for extraction teams, corporate or otherwise. Mark it as." He looked at the glowing ring bisecting his boots. "A preserve." There was a pause as bureaucracy tried to grow a new mouth for this sentence. "On whose authority, Sergeant?" "On mine," he said, and then, because sometimes you have to offer translation to people who love nouns more than verbs, "and on theirs." Above him, high enough that only silence could measure it, a shadow crossed the sun. Once, like a hand passing over a lamp to say, "Still here." He saluted it without thinking and felt like an idiot, and didn't mind. He lifted the shuttle on engines that had not forgiven him but had chosen not to complain. The clearing shrank to the size of a coin. The coin glinted, a steady pulse in the swamp's sullen green, A ring set not to adorn but to warn. This was the place where someone owed something to someone and had paid. He climbed through cloud that smelled like old rain and found the cold brightness of upper sky. The instruments picked up escorts, brief, bright flares on the edge of detection, as if the air itself had decided to see him safely to altitude. At orbit, the board lit with a dozen angry messages from entities who had planned to own something today and found their contract riddled with mud. He ignored them. He checked the brace of his own bruised hip, found it less sulky, and laughed aloud at the sudden memory of an enormous paw set down beside him, claws neatly sheathed, offering leverage without lecture. They met him at the edge of space, the way old stories meet heroes. Not with trumpets, with recognition. 3 bodies slid out of the glare and paced the shuttle for a minute that stretched long enough for his throat to tighten. The largest dipped a wing. In no atmosphere, it was ridiculous. In the human imagination, it meant everything, and then arrowed away with the casual certainty of things that have remembered their jobs. He set the shuttle down on a carrier deck where the paint was new and the crew was curious. People gathered because people always do when something changes, and they want to stand near it in case some of it rubs off. They asked questions with too many words. He answered with ones that fit in a medlog. Alive. Mobile. No, I didn't tag him. Yes, he tagged me. He didn't request leave. He took it. He went back down, not to the clearing, which belonged now to bigger songs, but to the other places the mud keeps its secrets. The floodplain past the bend, the drowned grove where the water remembers a village, the narrow channel where logjams turn into coffins. He put up 3 more tarps. He stashed water filters in hollow trees. He painted a ring with a line through it on a dozen posts hammered into the wet ground and taught up the miners and the mushroom cutters and the runaways what it meant. Stop here, breathe, share what you have that is warm. The stories outran him, which is their nature. On a mining rig, a boy with his mother's hands drew the sign over a bunk and slept better. In a market orbiting some other moon, a woman with a scar that looked like a river brushed a pendant in the shape of a ring in line and found herself braver by a measurable degree. On a radio, in a guard hut, 2 men who had never seen a Vralion argued about whether they could teach their captain to become less of a problem and concluded, absurdly and correctly, that yes. On Valtran 7, the circle in the clearing dimmed to the low glow of embers and did not go out. When storms walked in, they stepped around it. When drought leaned in, it leaned less. Once, near dusk, a shadow larger than weather dropped to the edge of the mangrove bone, considered the absence of tarp and triage lamp and small, stubborn human, and touched the ring with the tip of one horn. The mud shone brighter for a breath, then settled. Months later, on a patrol over an entirely different kind of trouble, Darren felt a pressure in his chest that wasn't fear. He looked up through a canopy of smoke and found, framed there, a shape he knew from the bones outward. Younger still, healed imperfectly, the way honest work always heals, eyes bright, wings wide. The Vralian fell alongside his shuttle like a river choosing to match a stone's speed for a while. No roar, no ceremony. The head dipped once, a hello that remembered being a goodbye and disliked the term. Darren lifted his hand from the stick and pressed it to his sternum, over the place where an old warmth seemed to have left a mark he could not wash off. Still counting, he said, absurd in a cockpit that had heard much worse. The beast veered into weather. The shuttle veered into duty. Below them, a world learned and relearned the oldest law written in mud and breath and the slow defiances of a body deciding not to die. Keep each other. Keep.